Thanks very much, Philip. Very glad to be here. This is a great institution which I've had dealings with in the past, and also very good to be sharing a platform with the Post-Crash Society, which is a project that I strongly support and have worked with in the past for reasons I hope will become obvious as you listen to what I have to say here. And indeed, I am going to argue that given the situation that we're in and likely to be in the near future, the market is indeed what will save us. And I'm going to really try and argue 3 points essentially. First, that the crisis of 2008, the aftermath of which we're still living in, and which I think has not yet fully worked itself out, was entirely foreseeable, contrary to what many people would have you believe, and indeed was foreseen by many, including myself, and that it arose ultimately from a misunderstanding of what a market economy actually ought to be based upon and how it ought to work. A misunderstanding which I'm afraid to say many professional economists played no small part in propagating. And that secondly, in the aftermath of that crisis, we, by which I mean public policy makers in most parts of the world, did not do what we should have done. We didn't, if you like, act in the way that understanding of market principles sort of led us to act, and instead we acted in a way that was both short-sighted and ultimately, I think, very dangerous. And that thirdly, I think probably we are actually, not out of the woods yet. I think there quite likely is going to be, probably in the next 9 months or so, another round of the financial crisis. And I think that in the situation that we are in then, we're going to be faced up with the choices we ducked several years ago in 2008, and I think that we're actually, however, and this is the good news after all the gloomy stuff, we're actually in a situation where it is markets and the innovations that markets are currently bringing to the world economy which will lead us out of the wood that we'll otherwise find ourselves in. So first of all, as I say, I believe very strongly that the crisis we had in 2008 was completely foreseeable. I began to think in the year after the crisis that I was going to hang myself if I had to read yet another article telling me that the crisis of that year was A, unprecedented, and B, something that nobody could have expected. I mean, have these people never read history? That's my immediate reaction to that. Have they never heard of Dutch tulips or the South Sea bubble or God knows how many other financial crises? It was completely foreseeable, and I don't claim any special prescience in this. I gave a talk to some university students in Cambridge in 2006 where I told them that, this is on the record, that there was going to be a very serious financial crisis within the next 2 to 3 years. And it didn't take any special genius to do this. You just needed to know what the warning signs for a financial crisis were. Now, what lay behind this? Well, you'll often hear that this was due to lack of regulation, but quite honestly, and without any exaggeration, if you had piled up all the regulations that the Financial Services Authority had in force at that time, they would quite literally reach to the top of that concrete wall behind me. Now, if that is under-regulation, I'd like to know what over-regulation is. There may have been the wrong regulations, but you certainly can't say that there was a lack of regulation behind all this. What instead I think lay behind it was a form of intellectual hubris which had come to infect the economics profession and a large part of the financial services industry. A belief essentially that the world was more controllable, more predictable than it actually is. And there was a widespread belief basically that they'd got rid of risk. That they'd managed to hedge it all away. There was no longer any serious risk. The business cycle was abolished. Everything was just going hunky-dory. By the way, if you ever hear famous economists telling you you've got rid of the business cycle, that's the time to panic, because it invariably means it's about to come back and bite you on the backside. And of course, what they did not realize was the distinction between risk and uncertainty. They did not understand the nature, in fact, of the kind of principles they claim to be dealing with, which is that you're dealing with a world of radical uncertainty, ultimately, in which ultimately also you have to have a system based on the principle of profit and loss. That is what market economies, capitalism, if you will, is based upon. You can't have an economy which is all profit and no loss. That kind of idea, private profit, socialized losses, is not only morally incoherent, it's extremely dangerous, because if people think that no matter what they do, any losses they make are going to be made up by the taxpayer, that means they're going to bet the mortgage on a pair of twos, basically. They're going to behave utterly recklessly, which is what they did, of course. Now, what should we then have done? Well, had you applied market principles correctly, I think, in the aftermath of the crisis, what we should have done was bitten the bullet. We should basically have allowed the major financial institutions that had made these foolish decisions to be wound up. We should certainly have let HBOS and RBS and a number of other banks just go bust. Instead, what we did was we bailed out not the shareholders, who took a seriously big hit, as I know personally, but the bondholders. We bailed them out completely. And what we did, in other words, was to protect the investments made by seriously rich people who had made foolish and misguided choices. That is not how a market economy, a capitalist economy, is meant to work. What we should have done was what Iceland did, which is to bite the bullet and allow the institutions that had acted on the basis of these hubristic false beliefs to go under. Now, that would have been really, really difficult, as it was in Iceland. We would have had about 8 months to a year and a half of serious economic pain. That's undeniable. A lot of companies would have gone out of business. A lot of rich people would have discovered they were nowhere near as rich as they thought they were. And above all, a huge amount of malinvestment, mistaken wrong investment, which had been done during the boom that led up to the crisis, would have had to be liquidated. As it was, we engaged instead in quantitative easing. Which I think has been aptly described as a form of socialism for the rich, actually. We pumped huge amounts of money into the world economy and the world banking system in order to prevent an adjustment in asset prices, which is exactly what we should have had and what market principles would have demanded that we had. All kinds of assets, particularly real estate, but other things as well, were seriously misvalued. A whole load of investments had been made that were never, ever going to pay. And those investments need to be liquidated. Now, what we did was to avoid doing that. And that was not acting on market principles, it was acting according to rather base political principles, actually, of bailing out people with political pull and power. And whatever else you may say about that, that's not in accordance with the principles of a market economy or market forces. Now, where are we now? Well, we're certainly in a better place than we were a few years ago, 7 years ago or so, but we still have not dealt with the problems that we should have dealt with in that way in 2008, 2009. According to the Council of Mortgage Lenders, between a quarter and a third of mortgages would be in distress. In plain English, people wouldn't be able to pay them if interest rates were to start going up again. Another reputable report says that between 20% and 25% of all businesses in the United Kingdom are only staying afloat because interest rates are basically at a historically unprecedentedly low level of virtually zero. Now, what that means is that those companies are actually really insolvent. They really ought to be wound up and allowed to go bust. And from the economist's point of view, when they're not being wound up, that means that the resources, the assets that they control, that they have, are not being used effectively. They're being used and locked up in unproductive, unprofitable uses. Obviously, you can see why the politicians want to do this, but the problem is that the longer they've gone on doing this, the worse things are going to be. And I think myself, I fear, I hope I'm wrong, but I strongly suspect that we're going to see quite a lot of bankruptcies in the next 9 months. There's going to be probably quite a wave, sparked off probably, I think, by the collapse of a lot of shale oil paper in the United States, which with the collapse in oil prices has now become pretty much worthless in many cases. Now, what should we do? Well, we should do, and this is why I think that the market is what will save us, 2 things. First of all, we should do what we should have done in 2008. We should actually apply market principles and liquidate the bad investment. A tough choice, undoubtedly, but I think the right choice, because once it's done, we can then recover. We can get over the malinvestment that was caused by the artificial boom brought about by the artificially cheap money and low interest rates that the world's central banks created in the aftermath of 2001. Moreover, I do think in the longer term, I'm very optimistic that the market is indeed producing a revolution in the way the economy works right now. What drives market economies is innovation. And what we're seeing right now is an unprecedented wave of innovations in business, in the way commerce and industry are organized, through things like the so-called sharing economy, Airbnb, Uber, all of the other institutions that you've seen arising. Paul Mason at Channel 4 claims that we're moving into a post-capitalist economy. I don't know where he gets this from, actually, because to me this sounds more like capitalism on steroids, because basically the promise of this new economy that we're seeing is a world in which every man and woman is a capitalist, because pretty much every asset you can think of will become income generating. And that is the essence of what capitalism is. And I think that that is the way forward. We should not cling on to old and by now decrepit or insolvent companies and firms. We should basically go forward into the kind of new world that the market actually, I think, is bringing up right around us, which is going to be a much more humane economy, one not dominated by large firms, but rather by networks. And it's for that reason that I think that it is the market that will save us, and it's the fact that we did not follow market principles in 2008 that means we are still not out of the wood and facing, I'm afraid, a pretty tough couple of years in the near future.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you.